بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وبعد. Continuing from where we left off, our topic today is about honoring and venerating and holding in esteem, number one, the Quran, and number two, the books that were sent down by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then by extension all of the other books that are either written to explain it or just books in general. But the primary book that we're talking about is none other than respecting and honoring the Quran. And so Imam al-Zarnuji, he says, وَمِن تَعْظِيمِ الْمُعَلِّمِ تَعْظِيمُ الْكِتَابِ. And from honoring or venerating or respecting the teacher is respecting the book. Over here, the book refers to none other than the Quran, and then by extension other books. Then he says, فَيَنْبَغِي لِطَالِبِ الْعِلْمِ أَلَّا يَأْخُذَ الْكِتَابَ إِلَّا بِالطَّهَارَةِ. He says that it is for a student of knowledge, somebody who seeks knowledge, to not take this book except in a state of tahara. Meaning the person that picks up the Quran or picks up any book in general should be in a state of tahara, but in particularly the Quran. Then he says, وَحُكِيَ عَنِ الشَّيْخِ شَمْسُ الْأَئِمَّةِ الْحَلْوَانِ رَحِمَهُ اللَّهِ أنه قال إنما نلت هذا العلم بالتعظيم فإني ما أخذت الكاغد إلا بالطهارة. That one of the great scholars by the name of Shams al-A'imma al-Halwani, he said that I only attained the level that I attained in knowledge by respect. By respecting what? He said that any time I took the kaghad refers to the tablet. It refers to a tablet in which the Quran would be written down or books would be written down. He said I would only take it except when I was in a state of wudu. I wouldn't take it otherwise. And then it's said by Shaykh al-A'imma As-Sarakhsi rahimahullah kana mabtuna, that one of the great scholars of the Hanafi madhab, he used to have a lot of stomach problems. He used to get sick and he would lose his wudu a lot. And وَكَانَ يُكَرِّرْ فِي لَيْلَةٍ, that he used to like to recite the Quran at night, and he would like to recite a lot at night. فَتَوَضَّأَ فِي تِلْكَ اللَّيْلَةِ 17 مَرَّةً, that he made wudu 17 times in one night just so he could read Quran. Right? لِأَنَّهُ كَانَ لَا يُكَرِّرُ إِلَّا بِالطَّهَارَةِ, that he would only recite the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a state of tahara, even though in reciting you technically don't need wudu. You need wudu for salah, and you need wudu to actually touch the mushaf. But to recite you don't need it. But what would he say? He would say, وَهَذَا لِأَنَّ الْعِلْمَ نُورٌ وَالْوُضُوءَ نُورٌ فَيَزْدَادُ نُورُ الْعِلْمِ بِهِ. He would say that knowledge is a light, and wudu is a light, and light only increases light. And that's why he would say my wudu is a means of increasing the light of my knowledge. And so this is the first advice that's given, is that when you read a book, when you read the Quran in particular, make sure that you do it in a pure, in a clean state, and that includes the place that you're in, the clothes that you're wearing, and obviously the physical wudu. Then he says, وَمِنَ التَّعْظِيمِ الْوَاجِبِ أَلَّا يَمُدَّ رِجْلَهُ إِلَى الْكِتَابِ, that he would say that from the obligatory veneration or respect of the Quran is not to extend one's feet towards the Quran or towards any book. And the reason why he wrote al-wajib, it's because it's not actually wajib. You can technically extend your feet towards the Quran. However, the person that wants to attain knowledge, he must learn to even respect the book, right? Even if there is no evidence, because this is part of adab and akhlaq with knowledge. And then he would say, وَيَضَعُ كُتُبُ التَّفْسِيرِ فَوْقَ سَائِرِ الْكُتُبِ, that the books that explain the Quran, the books of tafsir, when organized in a bookshelf, they should be at the top, and then everything else should come after. Why? Because those books are none other than the books that explain the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and obviously the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is supposed to even be above that. Then he says, وَلَا يَضَعْ عَلَى الْكِتَابِ شَيْئًا آخَرَ, and he would say don't put anything over a book. Sometimes you might see somebody put a book on a table and put a glass of water on top of it, or they might put a bottle of ink on it, or something, they put something on it. He's saying don't do that. And then he explains why. He says, وَكَانَ أُسْتَاذُنَا شَيْخُ الْإِسْلَامِ بُرْهَانُ الدِّينِ رَحِمَهُ اللَّهِ. One of his teachers, Burhanuddin, he would narrate, and Shaykh min al-Mashayikh, that one of his teachers said that the faqih, the person of knowledge, أن فقيها كان وضع المهبر على الكتاب, that one of the scholars, they put their ink bottle on top of a book, and that person's teacher, he told that student, he said, Bur niyabi, which is a word in Persian or Farsi. He said Bur niyabi, which means that you will never benefit by your knowledge because you disrespected the book. Why did you disrespect it? Is because when you put ink on top of a book, what are the chances of happening? The chances are that the ink will fall. It will ruin the Quran. It will ruin the book that you're reading. And that's why for us, it's about respecting it no matter what. And so whether it's water, nothing should be above the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And then he says, وَكَانَ أُسْتَاذُنَا الْقَاضِي الْإِمَامِ الْأَجَلْ فَخْرُ الْإِسْلَامِ الْمَعْرُوفِ بِقَاضِي خان رحمه الله يقول إن لم يرد بذلك الاستخفاف فلا بأس به والأولى أن يتحرز عنه. Then he says that one of the scholars by the name of Fakhr al-Islam al-Ma'ruf bi-Qadi al-Khan, that one of the scholars that was known as Qadi Khan, he used to say that as long as the person doesn't intend belittling the Quran by placing something upon it, there's no problem. So technically it's not haram. It's not haram to put the Quran on the ground. It's not haram to put something over it. However, it is better not to do those things because it increases veneration and love and respect for you in your eyes for those things, and therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will increase you in those things because of your respect. Then he moves on to something else, and that is the art of note-taking with the scholars. And then he says, وَمِن تَعْظِيمِ الْوَاجِبِ أَن يُجَوِّدَ كِتَابَةَ الْكِتَابِ, that from honoring the obligatory honoring of the Quran is that somebody learns to write well, and they learn to write clearly, right? And then he says, وَلَا يُقَرْمِطَ. يُقَرْمِط literally means to write so tiny that you yourself can't read it later, right? He's saying don't write tiny. وَيَتْرُكُ الْحَاشِيَ إِلَّا عِنْدَ الضَّرُورَةِ. And he's saying that you should leave the marginalia, which is the sides of the book. If you look at the books today, you don't see much of a marginalia. But back then, when they would print books, they would leave the sides open for people to annotate or take notes on the side. And he's saying that when it comes to the Quran in particular, he's saying that don't write on the marginalia. Because what might happen is that because the Quran was handwritten before by a lot of people, he's saying that there will be a mixing of the Quran and of your notes. And so don't do that. Obviously in a regular book it's fine to do that, but again the same advice applies, that you make sure that the notes that you write are not tiny. And then he explains why. He says, وَرَأَى أَبُو حَنِيفَ رَحِمَهُ اللَّهِ كَاتِبًا يُقَرْمِتْ فِي الْكِتَابَةِ. The Abu Hanifa, he saw a writer, somebody who was taking notes, writing really tiny in the marginalia, in the notes area. And he said, فَقَالَ لِمَا تُقَرْمِتْ خَطَّكَ. Why are you writing so tiny? Why are you taking notes like this on the side? And then Abu Hanifa, he says, إِن عِشْتَ تَنْدُمْ وَإِن مُتَّ تُشْتَمْ. That if you live, you will regret it. How will you regret it? Because as you get older, your eyesight weakens. You can't see anymore, right? So he's saying that don't write so tiny, right? And then he says, وَإِن مُتَّ تُشْتَمْ. And if you die, you will be blamed. Why? Because you wrote on the Quran. And so, again, normal books, it's fine. The Quran, you shouldn't write anything in it. There is one exception, and that is if you're writing out your mistakes and you're writing out the places where you need to correct stuff. But actually taking notes in the Mus'haf is something that should not be done ever, right? And again, if you're writing in another book, make sure that you write big as well. Then he says, يعني إذا شخت وضعف بصرك ندمت على ذلك. وحكي عن الشيخ الإمام مجد الدين السرحكي أنه قال ما قرمطنا إلا ندمنا وما انتخبنا إلا ندمنا وما لم نقابل إلا ندمنا وينبغي أن يكون تقطيع الكتاب مربعا. He says that one of the scholars by the name of Majduddin As-Sarhaki, he used to say that we never wrote tiny, and when we wrote tiny it caused us regret later because we got older. And then he said we never summarized things, because when we summarized things, what ends up happening is that we don't understand our own summaries. We don't understand our own short notes, right? So short notes are supposed to be done at the time when you're in the class. But when you leave the class, you go back and you write everything out. This is the method of the scholars. And then he says, وَمَا لَمْ نُقَابِلْ إِلَّا نَدِمْنَا, and he's saying that we wouldn't combine different books together. For example, somebody is reading the Mus'haf and they start writing hadith on the side. Why? Because there's a chance of mixing the two forms of evidence or whatever it is. And so he said we wouldn't do that, right? We'd have a separate place to do that. And then he's saying that a book should always be in the shape of a square. And you might think this is a weird thing to say. Sometimes paper came in different shapes and sizes. Sometimes it was longer. Sometimes it was shorter. And the reason why he's saying that a book should be in the form of a square like the books that we have today is because this was the way of the scholars of the past, including Imam Abu Hanifa. And he would say that this way of having the book, it makes it easier to hold while walking. It makes it easier to shelve with other books. And it makes it easier to review, right? And then he said, وَيَنْبَغِي أَلَّا يَكُونَ فِي الْكِتَابِ شَيْءٌ مِّنَ الْحُمْرَاءِ. And this one is a little bit strange. He's saying that there should be nothing in the book that is red, right? Meaning that you shouldn't write in your books with red. The first thing that you learn in public school or any school is that the teacher dislikes when you write with a red pen, right? With the red pen. And so the scholars, they also dislike that because, again, a red pen is used for grading. It's not used for anything else. And then he would say, فَإِنَّهَا صَنِيعُ الْفَلَاسِفَ لَا صَنِيعَ السَّلَفِ. That writing with a red pen or having a red cover, like a really bright red cover, not like a maroon cover, but a really bright red cover or a red pen, he said this is the practice of the philosophers, not the practice of our righteous scholars and those that came from the Sahaba. And then he would say, وَمِن مَشَائِخِنَا مَنْ كَرِهَ إِسْتِعْمَالَ الْمُرَكَّبْ الْأَحْمَرِ. That from our teachers was somebody who used to dislike somebody using red ink. And this is where we'll stop. And the reason for the dislike is because, number one, that when you use red ink, certain people are colorblind. Number two, it's used in the position of a teacher to correct a student, and that's why it's disliked. And it's just not the practice of the scholars, it's the practice of the philosophers. So the thing that we should take away from today's small brief reminder is that, number one, is that if you want knowledge in life, if you want to understand the Quran better, understand that it is light, and so it's best to have it in the state of tahara, and to actually respect the physical book is part of respecting the actual message of the book. And then last but not least is when you take notes, you don't mix it with the Quran. You can do it in a separate paper and make sure that you write big and that you don't use a red pen. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq to act upon this and to continue to honor the books of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to honor every single thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has had the karam to teach us. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.